Well, good afternoon to you all. I was lecturing in Norway some years ago, and the chairman said, "Your name is Brian J. Ford. Do you realize if you slid the J along a little bit, you could become Brian Fjord, which would be very suitable for where you're lecturing. Are you going to do that?" Quick as a flash, I said, "No way." The thing is, those are the answers you normally think of after you've left the room, aren't they? But on that occasion, it came at once. Now, I've always been interested in food. I've written a number of books on food and done television programs and radio programs on it too. And I'm not sure whether any of us realizes quite how much it is that we eat. So come back to the 1990s, when on television we did something that had never been done before.
Hello, and welcome to Food for Thought. My name is Brian Ford.
And my name's Marion Bowman. Tonight and for the next 7 weeks, Food for Thought will be taking a long, hard look at what we eat.
We've spoken to everyone from the farmer through the shopkeeper to the consumer to get a behind-the-scenes view of how food gets into your shopping basket and from there onto your plate.
We've spoken to doctors, nutritionists and dietitians to find out what it's doing to us after we've eaten it.
It's easy to take eating for granted. It's something we do 5 or 6 times every day. But this is the scale of our subject.
In this warehouse, Food for Thought has brought together the amount of food the average person is likely to eat in a lifetime of 70 years.
So if you are an averagely omnivorous person looking forward to your 70th birthday, you will have eaten your way through 36 of these endearing little creatures, in addition to 7 cows, dozens of pigs, and perhaps 550 chickens. The amount of water I would drink in a lifetime would fill a 10-litre swimming pool, and I'd have drunk the contents of one of these milk tankers. That's about 2,000 gallons of milk. I'd consume some 13,000 eggs and nearly a ton of butter, cheese, and margarine, together with 20,000 potatoes.
There's 100 kilos of salt and over a ton of sugar to get through.
And, eat your heart out, Popeye, over 2 tons of green vegetables.
Nearly 2 tons of fresh fruit.
Over 1.5 tons of breakfast cereals, biscuits, and cakes.
Over a ton of canned food.
Nearly 5 times my weight in tea and coffee.
3 times my weight in honey and jam.
7 times mine in frozen food. And over 200 kilos of pickles. It's all, you could say, rather a lot to take in, isn't it? The traditional way of approaching this problem has been to look at what we eat every day, not in terms of beans or chips or sausages and fruit, but in terms of these, the components of our diet. According to that sort of analysis, we eat about 80 grams of plant and animal protein in a day, 128 grams of fat, both animal and vegetable, 117 grams of fatty acids on average, 360 grams of carbohydrates, a gram or so of minerals, and a few milligrams of these vital health-giving vitamins. The whole lot has an energy content of about 2,800 calories.
Of course, the one thing I missed out, and I realized it after we'd been filming, was that we'd also have had, on average, a turkey at least once a year. Now, at home, we've never had a turkey. Turkey is the classic meal that we always have at Christmas time. And I've never much liked it. It's rather dry. And we did once have a boned and dressed turkey, I remember, but we've had capon. I once did a beef and oysters. We had a salmon, we've had grouse, partridge, pheasant, guinea fowl, all sorts of things. But I've never much liked turkey, and yet it remains the most popular meal at Christmas time of all. And of course, 60% of people in Britain will have a turkey on Christmas Day, and about a quarter will not have any meat at all. And this is what the wild turkey is like. They've been first domesticated probably 3,000 years ago. And the wild turkey, which you see in the States, weighs between 5 and 10 kilograms. A farmed turkey now can weigh over 40 kilograms. The turkey was regarded as almost spiritual by the Aboriginal inhabitants of the United States. And of course, it's turkey feathers that made up their magnificent headdress. And it's not only the feathers that they used, they also used the leg bones to make musical instruments. These are flutes made of the femurs of turkeys at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture in Santa Fe in the state of New Mexico in the States. It's not a new thing to do. Henry VIII ate turkey at Christmas. This was in the 1540s, and he spent on the Christmas celebration in that year the equivalent in modern money, believe it or not, of £13 million in celebrating Christmas. Now, you very often find similar creatures on both sides of the Atlantic, because at one time, of course, the two were joined, and after they've separated, evolution went its own way. But we in Britain have our own version of the turkey, the capercaillie. It's very similar. It's now a dwindling species. It needs to be conserved. They weigh about 3 or 4 kilograms, no more than that, so they've never been considered for farming. But turkeys themselves, about 10 million turkeys at least will be eaten today in Britain. And twice as many as that eaten in the United States. Now, America has a very interesting tradition, which actually isn't a tradition at all. They talk about the turkey pardon. And it's widely said that the American president will get a turkey and will pardon it. Turkeys, of course, in America are eaten at Thanksgiving rather than at Christmas. At Christmas, it's very often ham that they eat, which is odd when you think of it, in the sense that Jesus, remember, was a Jew, at least on his mother's side, and Jews wouldn't eat ham. But nonetheless, ham is very popular in the States for Christmas, and it's the turkey they always have for Thanksgiving. Now, President Biden, on the 28th of November this year, he pardoned a turkey, and it has been said that it dates back to President Truman. But nobody knows why they say that, because there is no record of President Truman ever having done any such thing. And this is the official statement that comes from the Library of Congress. They have checked extensively, and no, they have never found any suggestion that President Truman ever pardoned a turkey. On the contrary, most years, he mentioned that it was going to end up in the family kitchen and was going to be eaten with pleasure. So that legend that President Truman started the pardoning of the turkey ceremony, I'm afraid is completely false. But President John F. Kennedy, he was given a 25-kilogram turkey. And as he examined it and caressed it on the podium, he is supposed to have said to an aide, maybe we'll return this one to the farm. And that may be where it started, because President Richard Nixon did much the same sort of thing. He said that he would not consume this turkey. And President Carter actually pardoned the turkey and forgave it and said its life would be spared. So I think what's probably true is that this tradition gently grew over recent presidencies, and it's now accepted by so many people that it began with President Truman, but it didn't. It just slowly grew as people became a little more humanitarian and a little more thoughtful of the fate for what happens to animals on the farm. President George Bush actually said, November the 24th, 2003, he actually said, I appreciate you joining me to give this turkey a presidential pardon. And that's the first time that those actual words were ever used. So this is the Thanksgiving turkey. It commemorates the first American food that was received by the settlers from the indigenous population. And of course, the turkey has since come to be the hallmark of Christmas and Thanksgiving in the States. And a recent record was set when 8,000 drones were sent up to recreate a turkey. These drone displays are very interesting. You might think that each drone is in radio contact with the drone next door, and that's how they're programmed. But no, every drone is actually entirely independent. They're all related to signals from satellites. Each one is programmed to relate to the satellite. It has no knowledge of the fact that there's a drone next door. But the way in which they make these enormous displays is really quite extraordinary, isn't it? It's a symbol of Christmas to us and Thanksgiving to the Americans. And it's always served with cranberry sauce. It's easy to make, easy to grow. The cranberry is vaccinium. It grows in Britain. We have our own species of vaccinium. And it forms beautiful, red, luscious, acidic berries. There is a belief that they're grown in water, but they're not. They're grown in meadows, but the meadows are then flooded at harvest time because the berries then float off and can be easily raked up. It saves picking them. So that's where the notion of the lakes of cranberries comes from. That is a meadow all summer long. And it's only when the berries have ripened that the meadow is flooded, the berries float to the surface, and are raked off and collected. 1 million tons of cranberries are harvested every year in the United States. 1 million tons of cranberries. That's the traditional Christmas dinner as we would see it in Britain, and many other countries have it too. Here is the Italian version, where they serve it with olive oil and with sprigs of rosemary. I may say that olive oil is not a good oil for cooking. It breaks down about 190 degrees Celsius, whereas other oils like canola oil or sunflower oil, they don't break down until about 210, 220 degrees Celsius. So if you're going to fry something, it's better not to use olive oil, or better to use some heat-resistant oil for your cooking, and then splash the olive oil on afterwards. But the turkey has spread all the way from the American Indians right the way around the world. This is the Hodu Hebrew version, which is served with paprika and orange, and it is also served in Catalan. This is the Catalonian version of it. They called it an Indian bird, and served with thyme and with tomatoes and olive oil. This is the French dinde, D-I-N-D. Put the apostrophe in, and it becomes dinde. It means of India. It's very interesting that all of these various nationalities imagined that the bird came from somewhere exotic, though none of them ever assumed, or gave it the name, that it came from the United States, which I do find quite extraordinary. Here is the Spanish version, pavo turco. They thought it came from, as we have always named it, Turkey. It's quite bizarre how this notion arose, but everywhere you look, people named it after some exotic location, though never after America. This is Russian, which the Russian name means that it's Indian bird, and it's served with sugar and cider and coriander as the flavors. Here we have it in Greek. The Greek means French bird. It's quite extraordinary, isn't it? And they serve it with lemon zest and olive oil and herbs. I mean, in Arabic, for example, it is known as the Roman hen. That's what the Arabic means, and it's served with butter, orange, cinnamon, onion, and bay leaves. It's interesting, the Arabs traveled widely from the Mediterranean, came right up into Europe and, of course, around to Britain. Many of our English words derive from Arabic, and many of our cooking habits derive from Arabic too. The herbs that we use mostly come from the Mediterranean, from the Middle East, not from Britain at all. But we have adopted those cooking habits as part of our traditions. And it's moved even further away. Here it is in Malaysia, where it's known as Dutch chicken. It was imported, of course, the habit by the Dutch settlers, and that is where they got their name from. Now, the American, in Britain, we always serve it with red currant jelly, often with chestnuts, might be with pecans, cranberries, and herbs like rosemary, thyme, Mediterranean herbs, of course. But it isn't only a turkey that Europeans eat. In Britain, the head of a pig was always celebrated at Christmas time. And you still will find, once in a while, a pig's head is served at Christmas time. And I hope the following picture won't disturb you, but this is a traditional Norwegian Christmas, which is sheep's head, served just in the same sort of way as we in Britain would have served a boar's head. Roast goose was known to the ancient Greeks and the Romans. If ever you decide to cook a goose, it's a good idea to cook it upside down with the breast downwards, because the fat then runs down through into the breast meat and stops it getting too dry. It was quite popular in Britain until the 1920s. Then, of course, in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, chicken became most popular. And it was only when the mass production of turkeys became more widespread in the 60s and 70s that turkey began to become the mainstay of the British Christmas. When I was young, we always had a chicken, and I dare say some of you here who might be as old as I am used to have chicken when you were kids too. Of course, turkeys and geese were raised in flocks and were taken to market on foot. And what they used to do was, poor creatures, they would take the bird, dip their feet into hot tar, and then into sand to give them, as it were, custom-built Wellington boots to reinforce their feet. And they would then walk them from Norfolk down to London for sale. And indeed, turkeys in the United States were also similarly walked great distances. Here's an example from Texas before the First World War. Anyway, at the end of the day, this is what we ended up with. The roast bird has always been the mainstay of British Christmas dinner. And it's served, of course, typically with sage and onion, neither of which are British herbs. The sage herb comes from Persia and from the Middle East, and that's also where onions come from too. They were brought over by the Arabs and traded, and of course we have adopted them ever since. We have mint with lamb, don't we? Mint sauce. That also, of course, is an Arabic tradition, not a British one. And everywhere you go, you find that favourite Paxo. We all live and die by Paxo. It's a curious thing. In the garden at home, we've got sage and we have onions. And whenever I make stuffing, I always make it with Paxo. I've no idea why. If you look at the ingredients, it's really very mean on the sage. And sometimes I will chop up some sage leaves and sprinkle them in. But I was raised on Paxo stuffing and somehow can't break the habit. Chicken, the original Christmas bird that many of us will remember, as I say, when we were young, chicken originated in India. And that's what the bird was like. The modern birds, Rhode Island Reds and Sussexes and the others, are, of course, much more robust. They're much more meaty. They're much more profitable. Don't know whether you've seen Gladiator 2 as yet. And they were going on about the enormous extent to which they'd done historical research to make sure that Gladiator 2 was absolutely accurate in all respects. Oh, yes, in an early scene, you see a chicken farmer with these chickens running around, at least 2,000 years before they'd ever been developed. They had a scene in a temple where the lissom ladies are dangling their fingers in a pond with koi carp. I'm not sure they featured terribly prominently 2,000 years ago in ancient Rome either. And indeed, you will see a shepherd running a herd of entirely modern sheep. It's quite extraordinary that nobody's complained about that. I mean, I complained about it to my wife, but not to anybody else. I mentioned the Arabic influence, but one of the greatest influences on our food, especially at Christmas time, one of the greatest influences is the Norman influence. We know that the Normans came to Britain. We know that they conquered us in 1066. We know that Norman French was spoken in Britain for a couple of hundred years as the normal language of civilized and polite society. But I don't know how many people realize that Norman French is spoken to this day in the House of Commons and the House of Lords. When a new bill becomes an act of Parliament, that fact is announced in Norman French.
Deep Sea Mining Act.
La Reine le Vote.
Appropriation Number 2 Act.
La reine remercie ces bons sujets, accepte la benevolence, et ainsi le vote.
What appalling pronunciation. We all did better than that in school French, didn't we? But French Norman French remains one of the official languages of Parliament. And of course it's French, Norman French, that defined what we call our main meats. We don't eat cow, we eat beef, bœuf. We don't eat pig, we eat pork. We don't eat lamb, mutton. We eat mouton, mutton. We don't eat sheep meat. They call it sheep meat in Brussels. They talk about the amount of sheep meat that the British eat, but it's actually mutton, mouton, again from the Norman French. And the same with veal, veau, French. The Norman French remains with us every time we talk about the main meats that we eat. And of course the chicken, poultry, poulet. Yes, I'm afraid there's a lot of French in today's modern British food list. We accompany them, of course, with potatoes. The potato is a member of the deadly nightshade family. The berries are poisonous, and indeed wild potatoes, of the kind that you would find growing in Middle America, are very small and unprepossessing. But through breeding and selection over thousands of years, they become bigger and bigger and more succulent. This is the wild parsnip. You come across that species, haven't you, of hogweed, that if you brush against it brings out blisters. So does this. The original parsnip has toxic sap that will actually irritate your skin if you brush against it. Here's another example. Wild carrot, known as Queen Anne's lace. The leaves irritate the skin. And you may be surprised to know that carrots aren't orange. Carrots are white. This is the original carrot. But mutations of carrots occasionally developed orange pigmentation. And they were much appreciated by the Dutch at the time of William of Orange. And so the orange carrot became so popular, nobody wanted the white carrot anymore. So as carrots are being bred to become bigger and fatter and ever more succulent, they were also favouring the orange colour. And now, whenever you see carrots in any country in the world, they are always orange. But a carrot originally looked just like a parsnip. And the carrots that we now know celebrate William of Orange. And what about this wild plant, Brassica oleracea? You see it growing in little tufts all around the Mediterranean. This is the original form of kale from which all our brassicas are derived. There are some which were selected hundreds of years ago because the lateral buds seem to grow in profusion, and by selecting the seed and by carefully crossbreeding, people were able to create a form of kale in which the buds grew massively all the way up the stem, and this, of course, is our Brussels sprout. Now, I know that a lot of people don't like sprouts. Kids are famous for hating sprouts. And it's because if they're cooked too long, they develop sulfur compounds that taste bitter and unpleasant. So the trick with a sprout is to cook it for no more than 9 minutes, and then to serve it either with a little chopped ham or some diced fried bacon in the bacon fat. Then they actually become really quite delicious. I could eat a bowl of Brussels sprouts purely for the pleasure of the taste. And of course, this is another very popular vegetable that we have, which everybody calls broccoli. That's not broccoli. That is calabrese. Again, it is a mutation. It is a form. It is a specially selected version of the brassica in which the flower buds, instead of growing at the end of graceful little stems, all stay bunched together. Those are unopened florets. No, that's not broccoli. This is broccoli. Broccoli, purple, sprouting broccoli. That's the original broccoli, and you can see how selective crossbreeding would allow people to choose the look of the vegetable that they wanted to produce. We forget how clever were our ancestors. I mean, there's very little relationship between a wild boar and a domestic pig, as one example. And it's all done by selective breeding. We have created plants and animals for ourselves by breeding over the last 5,000 or 6,000 years. People often talk about eating natural food. None of the food that we eat is natural. Wheat, for example, is a human-made species that dates back thousands of years. We eat very little that is natural. All of our stuff has been enormously genetically selected and changed over the years by crossbreeding. And it's still going on now. This, for example, is called Calette and is a new form of brassica that is just becoming popular. The fashionable one this year is this one, tender stem broccoli. That was created by crossbreeding in Japan and is much more expensive than purple sprouting broccoli or Calabrese because it's the latest thing and because it's fashionable. It's also quite likely that with your meal, you may serve mushrooms. I don't recommend you to gather mushrooms because there are a couple, like the destroying angel, there are a couple of fungi which to the unaided eye, the untrained eye, do look surprisingly like mushrooms and are very, very toxic. It's interesting, when these mushrooms produce their spores on the end of their little hyphae, they always produce them in fours. All that family does, except for the mushroom that we cultivate, which produces spores in twos. So if ever you were of an inquisitive mind and had a microscope handy, you could tell at once whether something was actually a wild field-gathered mushroom or was one cultivated in a shed. Mushrooms are interesting. Fungi are fascinating. We always think of fungi as being like plants, but they're not. Fungi are actually a separate group of living things, almost halfway between plants and animals. I know they look plantish. I have no problem with people saying that they do. But what's interesting is that the cell walls of plants are made of cellulose. The exoskeleton of insects is made of chitin. You know, if you take, for example, you think of a cockroach, a piece of a cockroach, it's, brittle, brownish, plastic-like substance. That's chitin. Well, the cell walls of mushrooms, of fungi, are made of chitin. Fungus chitin, not cellulose. They have got something animalish about them. I was told this first in Potter's Bar at Ladbroke School in the 1940s by Miss Holroyd, who actually explained that fungi were not plants and not animals. They were something different. Lived with me that thought, and maybe one of the reasons why I ever became interested in biology as a career. A lot of people don't like mushrooms. If they're tossed in butter with a little crushed garlic, then they make a very appetizing dish. I have a version of this, which you might like to try. Just fry off some button mushrooms in a little butter with a little garlic, and then put in a glug of tomato ketchup and a shake or two of Worcester sauce and stir them around. They don't much taste like mushrooms, they taste much nicer. And that's a lovely dish to serve with meat. And then, of course, we have our own versions of things like pigs in blankets. Sausages have been known for 2,000 or 3,000 years. They were written about by Homer. And the bacon that comes from pigs are fascinating. We always talk about how genetic people are trying to interfere with life and act like God, the things we've done in the past. I mean, imagine taking a wolf and from it breeding a Chihuahua or a Pekingese or a pug. If any genetic engineer decided to make such a dramatic change, we would think it was the most appalling crime. But that's what people did by cross-breeding genetics for thousands and thousands of years. And the pig is an interesting case because the pigs that we now grow on our farms have 3 or 4 extra vertebrae in the backbone because it gives you more bacon. And they were selected about 7,000 years ago in what became Yugoslavia by farmers knowing how to crossbreed. It's quite extraordinary the extent to which we have changed nature in the past And it's time that we began to get real about the extent to which human society has altered nature to suit ourselves for thousands and thousands of years. Now, of course, plum pudding, originally made with minced lamb, as well as with fruit. I actually found an Elizabethan recipe for mincemeat some years ago, made with minced lamb, and made some minced meat pies with fruit of the kind that they would have made in the 1500s. I haven't ever done it since, but the kids did like them at the time. And isn't it interesting, again, that we talk about having a mince pie, and if somebody said to you, what's inside the mince pie, you'd say, why, mincemeat. And you say it without even stopping to think about it. But yes, it's minced meat. That's originally what it was. And the spices and the herbs and the fruit were put there to help disguise the taste of putrefaction in meat that had been stored for rather too long. So these pies were originally known as Christmas pies. You're eating mincemeat. You're eating something that was originally made with meat. And what about the Christmas pudding? Well, we love Christmas pudding. It's rich, it's rumbustious, it's full of flavour, it's full of nourishment. It's one of your 5 a day, it's got so much fruit inside it. And I don't know whether you've ever tried the idea of setting fire to a Christmas pudding. You see it in programmes, but don't often try it yourselves. The way to do it is this: to put your pudding, your nice hot pudding, on a heat-resistant plate, and then, here's the tip, put a little brandy into a ladle and warm up the ladle, perhaps over a candle. And then when the brandy is warm, if you tip it by the flame, then the ladle will begin to burn, and then you pour it over the pudding, and the whole pudding becomes alight. If you just pour brandy on, the brandy doesn't want to light. So that's the trick, is to warm up the brandy in a ladle, and then very judiciously set fire to it and pour it over the pudding. Do it most years, and it's enormous fun. And when the lights are off, it's really spectacular. Now, you notice that pudding is round. And if you look at cartoons of Christmas puddings, they always are spheres. They're always round. But the ones that we have at home are not round. The ones that we have at home are shaped like a pudding basin. And yet I discover that in part of Britain, they still make Christmas puddings, always by boiling them in cloth. And I found a lovely example in Kirkwall, in Orkney. The Cathedral of St Magnus is a remarkable place. We've stopped for coffee and a piece of the clooty dumpling, which to you and me is actually Christmas pudding. The dumpling means dumpling and the clooty means clothy, cloth, cooked in a cloth. So a clooty dumpling is a dumpling cooked in a cloth, and the recipe just happens to be the same as what we would regard as a very rich, fruity Christmas pudding. It's a dumpling cooked in cloth, boiled in muslin. And there are various recipes. Some of them contain quite a lot of flour and are quite pale in colour, almost a bit like a stollen. But the ones that we found are always really rich. And in fact, it's a very odd thing to go into a cafe in August and have a slice of a clooty dumpling, and you're eating a piece of cold Christmas pudding. And it's very popular in Scotland. I love to have some every time we go. So the Scots still maintain this tradition of making a round Christmas pudding, and we all ought to try it. We always buy Christmas puddings these days, but I urge you to try and make one and to cook it hanging on the handle of a wooden spoon over boiling water and in cloth, in muslin. And this is where it does get weird. This is the oddest thing that I ever came across in Britain over the normal Christmas pudding, because the clooty dumpling is very often eaten as part of a fried breakfast, which may seem odd to you, and it certainly seemed odd to me. So I thought we simply had to put that to the test. So, will a slice really work with a traditional fried breakfast? There's only one way to find out.
Wow.
Well, it looks all right.
It looks okay. But will it taste okay?
The moment of truth.
Mm.
So, how will it work? Well, extraordinary.
Here goes.
Unexpected.
Interesting.
Different.
Strange.
Sweet and sour, spicy blend.
Slightly weird.
Well, honestly, I'm tempted to say words fail me. They don't entirely fail me.
Very counterintuitive.
That really is surprisingly good. I'm not saying that it's going to be the destiny for every Christmas pudding left over in the future, but it's one of the most unusual tastes I've ever had in my life. Well, I never thought I'd ever be eating Christmas pudding with a fried breakfast. The Scots have given us many things, haggis.
Steam power.
They discovered the cell nucleus.
Penicillin.
And now, cootie dumpling or Christmas pudding with a fried breakfast. Well, there you are.
There
so
you
from
go.
both of us, a Merry Christmas
Merry Christmas.
and a Happy New Year. Ladies and gentlemen, have a wonderful Christmas day. I so hope you enjoy the rest of the cruise. You won't ever forget this trip. And from both of us, since this is my final presentation on this cruise, thanks for having come before and thanks for having come today. Thank you so much.